Well, I got another email because folks have enjoyed the timeline, WCW 1990 that I did with Kayfabe commentaries, along with some of the other ones I've done there. Check that out if you hadn't seen it. And they like our stories about specific shows or the columns I've done or whatever. But they said, what was it like just a whole week, like in order, in the old days, back in the territories, back in the good old days? And so I thought I would just grab the book. And I thought I'd start with Mid-South. Everybody likes Mid-South stories. And I just see where I was this week in history, so to speak, for 1984. Do you think this will be interesting?
I'm interested, so absolutely.
Is your interest peaked?
My interest is peaked.
Is your erector set?
Melania is playing with my erector set as we speak.
Well, there you are. All right. So what is? Oh shit! We established it was August 17th a while ago, didn't we? Okay, so it's August 17th. So August 17th, 1984, I was in Houston, Texas at the Sam Houston Coliseum.
Yeah, this is right after the dog left, too.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, I'm pretty, this was, yes, because the match, the Midnight Express were not there, but the match was Hercules Hernandez, the Big Cat Ernie Ladd, and Butch Reed against Terry Taylor, Hacksaw Duggan, and Sonny King, who had just come in and replaced Dog.
Yeah.
And it was a hospital elimination match where you had to bleed to be eliminated, and the last team with any members left was the winner. The house was $42,000 in Houston, which was not an exceptionally good house for Houston, Texas at that point in time, and I made $350. And basically, the baby faces went over when Hercules got the coal miner's glove that we were using at the time, and he went to swing at fucking Duggan, but he hit Ernie instead, and Ernie got juice, and the baby faces went over. And I recall that Ernie got the barest minimum of juice because it was not that great a house that night. But anyway.
Where were the Express?
They were off. That was... At one point, I think the guys asked, can we have some time off? We're dying. And so they got off like a big town, like Houston, Oak City, whatever, But basically, normally Houston was a 500-mile round trip. We lived in Alexandria, Louisiana. But it was 250 miles each way. But in this case, because we were in Lake Charles the next night, I stayed over in Houston. So basically, the motel was $32.95, and it was a fine place for that rate back in those days. And then the next day, we went on to Lake Charles to the Civic Center, and there the Express was there because they worked with Fantastics. And then I managed Hercules Hernandez against Hacksaw Duggan, and if Duggan won, he would get 5 minutes with me. But thankfully, Butch Reed came out and fucking knocked Hacksaw out with brass knucks, and Hercules pinned him 1, 2, 3 and saved me that indignity. And in that case, Houston to Lake Charles was 140 miles. So that was a short trip that day from the hotel. And then we went on to Alexandria that night after the show, and we got paid $200, by the way, for that event in Lake Charles. And I did the inflation deal. And found out if I'm mentioning a 1984 amount, about 2.5 times, because $100 then is worth $235 now. So almost 2.5 times.
So about $500 instead of $200.
Yes. Now the payoff in Houston was $350, because like I said, it was kind of a crummy house in Houston, and that was a 6-man elimination main event. So, but yeah, that would still be considered like say, about $850-ish or thereabouts. So then we're back in Alexandria on Saturday night, August 18th. Sunday, August 19th, Hope, Arkansas, the Watermelon Festival. 440 miles round trip of 2-lane fucking road.
Oh.
In the middle of fucking Arkansas. We worked with the Fantastics and went to a 20-minute draw. And then I managed Hercules against Duggan again, where basically Duggan was on top of Hercules, but I went and dropped a big elbow, and he moved, and I hit Hercules, and then Duggan slammed me on top of Hercules, and the referee saw it and disqualified us. And for that, the house was $14,000. I was paid the princely sum of $150, which would be about $375 these days. Now, having said that, After we got out of there at probably, I think that may have been an afternoon show. I do not have that recorded. But then we went back to Alexandria because the next day, Monday, August 20th, we were in Monroe, Louisiana, which was only 100 miles away at the beautiful Monroe Civic Center. So we could actually stay home that day. Usually Monday used to be New Orleans all the time. So that was a 200-mile trip each way, and most of it not interstate. But after Dog left and New Orleans kind of went down hills, they stopped running it as often. So going to Monroe, we could leave at 5 o'clock and still be there on time. Well, 4:30, which was like a day off to us. Anyway, we worked with Fantastics, and they beat us, and we made $125. The next day, Tuesday, we get up in Alexandria, go 130 miles to Shreveport, Louisiana for a house show. Shreveport was where we did TV every other Wednesday night, but every other Tuesday night was a house show at the Memorial Auditorium. And in that one, I managed Hercules against Sonny King. And as I recall, it was brutal.
I can imagine.
Oh, as a matter of fact, no, wait a minute. I'm looking at my notes. The finish is supposed to be, they do a 360 on a Irish whip out of the corner and come back in and wipe the referee out. And then Sonny King hits Hercules with his spear. And now at the time, Sonny was a nice man. But at the time, he was like, he had no physical definition whatsoever, and he was older and he was slow. And here's Hercules is 6'3" and 275 and jacked to the gills, about 10% body fat, right? And he moves like a goddamn tiger. Anyway, so Sonny hits the spear on Hercules and covers him. Butch Reed is supposed to fucking run in and fucking fuck Sonny, right? So that when he switches the pile and the referee comes back, comes back to consciousness, he'll count the pin and Hercules will win. He covers him. There's no Butch. It's the Shreveport Memorial Auditorium. There's a big stage, and the guys came out of either side of the stage and down the stairs, and you could see them coming, and no Butch. Finally, I said, fuck it. I rolled in, and I ran across the ring and jumped as high in the air as I could and came down with an elbow drop on the back of Sonny's head. It's probably the best-looking thing that happened in fucking past 5 minutes. And fucking he flipped over and I flipped the pile and threw the referee back and he won 1, 2, 3. And we Butch, when we got back, he was just coming down the stairs, still trying to tie a boot. Nobody told him that the fucking match was up or whatever the fuck. Oh my God. And Grizzly Smith starts yelling. So I left. I'd saved the day. So I got the fuck out of there before anybody yelled at me. And we got $60 that night. The house they were shooting deer in the balcony. Now, here's the thing. Regardless of wherever, thankfully, we were in Shreveport, and we got that $26 rate at the Alamo Plaza Motor Inn in Shreveport, because the next day on Wednesday, wherever you were on Tuesday night, it did not matter. Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock, you had to be at Channel 3 KTBS in Shreveport, Louisiana, to do interviews, the local interviews for the all the syndicated programs. And the top, say, 10 or 12, top 12 guys would be there. So it'd be like me, Butch Reed, and the Russians like Hacksaw or Nikolai Volkov, rather, and Crusher Khrushchev. And then it might be Hacksaw Duggan and the Rock and Roll or the Fantastics or Dog, whoever the top baby faces were. And we'd do those interviews from like 9 o'clock in the morning until fucking 3 or sometimes 4 in the afternoon, and then go to a town that night. So in this case, we did interviews in Shreveport from 9 o'clock until about 3 o'clock, and then hopped in the car and went to Beaumont, Texas, 200 miles and not all interstate, where we then proceeded to have a match with Hacksaw Duggan and Magnum TA, where basically I get fucking jerked over the top rope by Hacksaw, thrown onto fucking Dennis, and Butch comes in and fucks Duggan, and Dennis tops him 1, 2, 3. And then we get back in the car and go 160 miles back to Alexandria. So just in the previous 2 days, in case you're keeping track, we've gone 130 miles to Shreveport from Tuesday afternoon, had the show the Tuesday evening, stayed overnight in the hotel, done interviews for 6 hours, driven 200 miles through the backwoods of fucking Louisiana to get to Beaumont, Texas, worked a fucking show there, and driven 3 hours back to Alexandria, Louisiana, right? The next day, we're in Alexandria. We're home. The Rapides Parish Coliseum, by God. And the Midnight are off again, but I'm not, because I'm also managing Reed, Hercules, and Dr. Death against Sonny King, Hacksaw Duggan, and Terry Taylor in the main event, for which we were paid $125 for that one. But the following day, even though we were in Alexandria, the following day, Friday, August 24th, 1984, guess where we were? The By God New Orleans Superdome.
Oh, okay.
See, here's the thing. You were in Shreveport on Tuesday night in front of nobody on a shitty house with a half a card or whatever the fuck, and you get $60. And that Friday of that same week, you're in the Superdome, and the house is $165,000. There's almost 20,000 people there. So that payoff was $1,000, which would be by our formula $2,500, and that was the night the Midnight Express wrestled Dusty Rhodes and Sonny King. And that's the first time that Dusty worked with the Midnight and saw that he wanted us in Charlotte. And then I also managed Hercules against Hacksaw Duggan in a coal miner's glove match, which basically he lost. So I did double duty that night. But that was a 400-mile round trip for us. We left that Friday morning. We got to the Superdome, I would say probably about 4 or 5 o'clock that afternoon. We were supposed to be there plenty early, not just an hour beforehand, but as early as 4 o'clock instead of 6:30.
Can I ask you a couple questions?
Yes, go ahead.
First of all, when did you get your head shaved? Was it the month before?
Oh no, it was afterwards.
It was afterwards. Okay.
Yes, it was September when it did even less business.
What was it like at, let's say, a Superdome show? Were there a lot of local big shots in terms of politics and everything hanging around those shows? I'm just curious because I know Watts was very involved, with the Athletic Commission and all the other corrupt organizations in Louisiana.
No, I mean, there was, all the Athletic Commission people, and actually I think Watts' attorney was one of the Athletic Commission members, so they would be there. I mean, we wouldn't see them, but they would be there. But it wasn't, see, here's the thing, and Meltzer did a study on this. When WWE ran WrestleMania in the Superdome, there weren't as many people from the state of Louisiana as there were when Bill Watts ran the Superdome 4 times a year. People traveled from everywhere, but this was, I'll tell you who traveled. A lot of the girls traveled. The girls thought it was a big deal from the various towns, and that's sometimes guys got in trouble because worlds would collide. If the Mississippi girls and the Louisiana girls and the Arkansas girls were all in the same place at the same time, it could present issues. But the girls would travel, and plus it would be promoted on, Mid-South Television. There was a big Superdome event coming up, across. So you would get a few people, but primarily it was from a couple hours drive. And this was a Friday night, Friday, August 24th. So a lot of people had to work, right? But no, most of the people would be within a couple hours drive of New Orleans, Louisiana, that would come. And I'm just actually, let's see, we had previously run New Orleans on the last time on Monday, August 6th. I believe that's right. Hold on. Yes, Monday, August 6th. And I don't know what the house was. I didn't get it, but our payoff was $350. So I assume it was a pretty decent house in New Orleans. I would say 4,000 or 5,000 people. And then we came back 18 days later and drew 20,000 in the Superdome. And then after that, we would be back in New Orleans on Labor Day, Monday, September 3rd, when I'd get my head shaved, and the house would be only at $21,000, which was a disappointment. But my payoff was $600, which would be to $1,500 these days. But for $21,000, we expected, they had both sides of the auditorium opened up on that one. They expected a bigger crowd, but it was too much in the same area. Actually, the following week, when in Houston on the 9th, I actually made more money having my cousin Percy's head shaved because the house was better than I did getting my head shaved. They brought Jim Jameson, the job guy, down from Memphis and called him my cousin Percy. And so because they had to advertise my head was going to get shaved twice in the same week. So what are you going to do? Anyway, so the Superdome, we get down there about 4:30. We have the fucking match. We get out of there at 11 o'clock or whatever. We've got a 3.5 hour drive minimum back to Alexandria. So we get back, 3-ish in the morning. And then the following day, we're in Little Rock, Arkansas. Normally, that's 270 miles one way of 2-lane state highway, miserable trip. But we decide because we're going to Oklahoma the following day, we're going to fly. And the plane ticket was $281. Watts would give you $125 trans money on your check to go to Oklahoma every time we went. What you did with it was up to you. If you drove, you made money because you split the car with guys. If you flew, you lost money, but, you got there a little quicker. So that Saturday, August 25th, we get up in Alexandria. We fly. I believe this was the weekend that I swore off commuter planes for the rest of my life. We fly from Alexandria to Little Rock and check in at the beautiful Little Rock Holiday Inn Airport, where Sweet Connie was still doing her act at that point. We spent $24 on food. I splurged at the Holiday Inn restaurant, spent 24 whole goddamn dollars, which that was a feast back then. Anyway, our house was $27,000 because Little Rock was the shits that day. We got paid $200, and I managed the Midnight Express and in the 6-man hospital elimination. Then we went to Oklahoma City the next afternoon, continuing on this flight loop. Oak City at the Myriad was an afternoon show at 2:00, and this was the weekend that, because obviously of the Superdome, this was a weekend that also Flair was on top in Oak City and in Tulsa, and I can't remember who he worked with, God damn it, but they were the record houses that Oak City and Tulsa had ever done. These even beat the last Stampede because they didn't have a ticket flummox at the Myriad, and they were in a different building in Tulsa. So Oak City did $107,000 for the gate. Our payoff was $1,000. By that formula, it'd be $2,500. And as a matter of fact, we had a match with Dusty and Sonny King again. And then after we do that show from 2 to 4:30, we get in a fucking van. Watts would provide 2 vans, one for the heels, one for the baby faces. And we get in a van, and this fucking schlub that used to do stooge work for Mid-South would drive us. Not over 55 miles an hour. He wasn't allowed to get a speeding ticket. 100 miles up the road to Tulsa, where we had another fucking record house. And we worked with Fantastics, plus Butch Reed and Hercules worked with Dusty and Duggan. Great match, as I recall. $53,000 house, sell out there. We made another $400. Our trance was $125. So for the day, we made $1,525, which would be a little over $4,000 by our formula. And that was on top of the $1,000, which is $2,500 that we made on Friday, and that measly little $200 on Saturday. So what was that? About a $6,000 weekend?
Hey, those Flair matches, I don't remember the timeline correctly right now, but were those when they brought Kerry in to work with them?
That is exactly who it was. It was Flair and Kerry. It certainly was. You are correct, sir. You have saved me again. Yeah, that was, but once again, the promotion grossed $160,000 on Sunday for 2 shows. They had just grossed $165,000 at Superdome on that Friday night. Of course, I saw the check that Jack Curtis left the Superdome with on our last Stampede show, which the house was 173, I believe, and he left with 120. So it cost more than $50,000 to get out of that building back then.
See, I remembered it was Kerry just because I knew those were the towns that Fritz had a piece of.
Yes, and Oak City and Tulsa, and they also saw the world-class TV. And I believe that Kerry was on the Dome show, I believe, in a special attraction. But at any rate, the point is 320 and counting Little Rock, Mid-South Wrestling in 1984 for a 3-day period grossed $350,000.
Wow.
Which would apparently, by our calculations, this is starting to get big, about $850,000. And this was a territory. As you saw, we were working every day. As a matter of fact, and I know we're running low on time and I've already overshot my week, but here's what else we did. We were in Tulsa that Sunday night, right? So after that long fucking double shot day, we stay overnight at the Tulsa airport and we fly back to Alexandria on that commuter plane the next day. At the airport, we get in our cars and we drive 200 miles to Jackson, Mississippi. And there's the hospital elimination 6-man, and then 200 miles back that night for another $300, a $14,000 house. Then the next day, Tuesday the 28th, Baton Rouge, 200 miles. I'm sorry, I'll tell a lie, 100 miles, and 100 miles back, so there's a 200-mile round trip for another $175 because it was 15.7. Jimmy Killshaw was the promoter of the Baton Rouge Centraplex. And if you wanted to know what the house was, if it was kind of decent, he'd say 10.6, and if it was really good, he'd say 15.7. Even if it was $25,000, he'd still say 15.7. 10.6 most of the time. After Baton Rouge, we go back to Alexandria and get back about 12 o'clock, 12:30 at night. And then I have to leave Alexandria at 6 a.m. the next morning to go back to Shreveport to do the interviews from 9 to 3. Then we have about an hour and a half to get a pizza, and then we go to Shreveport TV at the Irish McNeil Boys Club and do 2 Mid-South television tapes that night, and then go back to Alexandria and get back about 1 in the morning, just in time to get up the next day on Thursday, August 30th, and go down to Laranja, Louisiana, which was a political thing. They had to run Laranja to get into Baton Rouge, which was 3 hours and something each way. So that pretty much went from 1 p.m. to 1 a.m. for $110. And then on Friday, August 31st, we had started there 2 weeks previously. We were back in Houston, Texas with the Midnight Against the Fantastics and Hercules and Duggan in a coal miner's glove match. And the house was up, and instead of 350, we got 400, which would have equated about about $9 or $1,000 in our formula. So in 2 weeks period of time in Mid-South Wrestling, we probably, besides that round trip plane loop, put in about, just in 2 weeks now, about 6,000 miles in the car. And we got paid about $4,500, which would be equivalent to somewhere around $11,000 at this point, and worked not only literally every day, but twice on 2 occasions, and 4 if you count promos and a show that night being a double shot.
Hey, it's interesting that they took the TV tapings out of the KTBS studio, but they kept doing the local promos there for years.
Yes. Well, because it was easier. It was quiet. It was a controlled atmosphere. You needed, Watts loved to do the cutaways because instead of one promo being the heels and the other promo being the baby faces, if you'll recall, they could ask and answer or challenge and accept or whatever, because they would shoot another studio where the heel was and then come back to the desk where the babyface was, or vice versa. So you could really talk to your opponents. It was ingenious, but they needed the TV studio for that. But it was just an empty studio that nobody was using on a Wednesday morning. And I mean, and Watts ruled the thing with an iron hand. The cameras were afraid to break down. And you literally, we would get some type of sandwich, I think. I think we got sandwiches. I can't remember exactly. But you were there for about 6 hours, and you did 3.5-minute promo inserts that would go in each show in each market twice. So like fucking 35 or 36 promos. And you had to learn he had formats down for everybody and a list of what was going to go on. But that's where you had to learn how to read the formats, because in Little Rock, the tape was on a slower bicycle than it was in some of the New Orleans or some of the Louisiana towns. So in Little Rock, you could only talk about what had happened up to TV show number 184, segment 3. But in New Orleans, TV show 187 had just aired. You were 3 weeks ahead. You could talk about all kinds of extra shit. And if you talked about anything in any of those promos that was jumping ahead of where it was going to go in the fucking local market's television slot, he would fucking shut you down and you would do that shit again, because you ought to be paying attention. You ought to be reading this shit.
What was it like in Memphis when they did those local promos with Lance?
Oh, fuck. Okay, Louisville, Lance, here's your sheet. Cornette, you do it. But in all fairness, they were doing promos for Louisville, Evansville, Lexington, Nashville, and Tupelo and Jackson. And they were only doing 1 week's worth for just the very next week, because we did that every week. Every Monday we were at the Coliseum and we'd shot the interviews for to go in the TVs the following weekends in those towns that we had just shot Saturday morning in Memphis. So it was you didn't have to keep up with much, but it was a lot looser paperwork. Let's put it that way. Sometimes if it was a fucking Tupelo show, and everybody hated to be booked in Tupelo anyway, if it was a fucking Tupelo show, they just let me do it for practice because I wasn't doing any of the big towns and nobody wanted to acknowledge they were going to be in Tupelo. So I think I did the local promo for Tupelo the first 9 weeks I was in the business, because I was also booked in Tupelo the first 9 weeks I was in the business, which was a rib in its own right. But that was, once again, that was a 2 week period. We were there for a year, and that was not unusual. I just picked because it was this week in that particular year. I could have come up with ones that were a lot harder. I don't know if I could come up with too many that were too much easier. I was off for 3 days in May, I think it was, for my uncle's funeral. I was off for 6 days when I got mono from Terry Taylor's fucking soft drink bottle, and my internal organs started shutting down. From lack of fucking, rest and recuperation. The worst, I can't remember exactly when it was, but the worst week we had in the car was like 4,300 miles while working a show at least once every day for 1 week.
You were there for a year. And of course, we've heard stories about, Buddy Landell and, antics on the road and car accidents and all sorts of things. But the time you're in Mid-South, was there anyone in the locker room who just, the schedule did break them? They finally got to the point where they couldn't do it anymore?
Oh, a couple of probably of the underneath guys probably gave their notice quicker than nobody came out and said, I just have to go. Dennis dropped out for 2 days once, but otherwise than that, I'm sure the underneath guys, it weeded you out. If you weren't serious about the fucking business, you didn't need to be there. But in a lot of cases, the opening match guys for a lot of that year were making checks of $800 to $1,000 a week that were in the opening match because business was so good. So a lot of guys wanted to get in there and figured they could put up with anything for a little while. But then Buddy Landell went through 3 cars that year, had accidents in 2 of them. So he was still driving a good one at the end of the year. DiBiase told me one time he stayed 18 months and his hair started falling out, and he had to leave. He had to get away. It was just too hard.
It was one thing just because Watts is Watts, not to take away from his wrestling genius, but Watts is Watts. It's one thing before they get Oklahoma, when they're just running the Louisiana towns and Mississippi and Arkansas. But once Leroy folds and Watts is back in Oklahoma, it becomes a ridiculous territory.
Well, but here's the thing. You say, you scoff at, just Louisiana and Arkansas. Those were the miserable fucking trips. In 1984, there were no north and south interstates in the state of Louisiana. And there was no interstate that would take you from central Louisiana to Little Rock, Arkansas. And sometimes in South Louisiana, the roads were so ridiculous. You were actually, if you were on highway such and such north, you were actually headed south because they had to go around the fucking swamps and the bayous and shit. In Oklahoma, at least, not only was there an interstate, because what you do is you just go to Shreveport and turn left and go to Dallas. We went through Fritz's territory 25 times in that year and never worked for him once, because you had to go through Dallas to get the interstate up to Oak City. But you could actually do Shreveport to Dallas and then to Oak City in like only 5 hours. And then they had an Indian Turnpike that was a nice 4-lane road from Oak City to Tulsa. And we would take that because every 2 weeks, almost regularly, every once in a while they'd only run one, but every 2 weeks, Oak City would run at 2 PM and Tulsa at 7:30 that night. And that was a huge gross for the day, but you worked your ass off. And then after Tulsa, when you drove, you had to go 450 miles overnight back to Alexandria, Louisiana. We'd get back at 6 o'clock in the morning. The sun would be coming up before we'd be home from the show we were at the night before. So when you drove that loop, we did it 1 year from the Superdome. That's why we flew this one, because we left the Superdome on Saturday night and drove 750 miles to Oklahoma City and got there to the Myriad in time to change clothes and take a shower before we went out because it was an afternoon show. So, but the point is, at least Oklahoma had it was flatter. It had some highways to it. But Arkansas and Mississippi could be fucking brutal too, because there's to this day, there's not a ton of interstate highways in Mississippi. But we weren't there that often. But Arkansas and Louisiana was horrible for travel. Even if the distances weren't that far, you couldn't underestimate anything. So it was you could get PTSD working a territory like that. But once again, the money that you could make compared to most other places in the business, and the education that you would get from a guy that ran not only as successful a territory, but also ran it with an iron hand as Watts did. You learn if you kept your ears open and your mouth shut, you learned a variety of things about the business, so you didn't have to just depend on one thing. Imagine that. But you also learned to get an automobile club membership. All right. Anyway, if people like that, we'll do some more upcoming in other years, because I got a bunch of them, depending on what week we're in. Corny on the road. And Harley Quinn has just come up to remind me that it's time to sign off.